The blood soaked through the bandage faster than Elena could replace it. The wolf on the table snarled in pain, and 3 other healers backed away, afraid to get closer. Elena did not step back. She pressed both hands against the wound and shouted for more cloth, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chaos of the healing tent. Outside, the sound of fighting still echoed from the tree line. Blackthorn territory had been hit at dawn, and no one had expected it. Elena had arrived only 2 days earlier, sent from a smaller pack to train under the region's best healers, and already she was standing in the middle of a crisis, with blood on her hands, and no time to be afraid. "He is losing too much," one of the older healers whispered, stepping toward the tent flap, as if she meant to fetch someone else, someone more senior, someone who might take over. "Then help me instead of talking," Elena snapped, and to her own surprise, the woman obeyed. Elena had grown up hearing that healers needed to stay calm, no matter what happened around them. Her mother, a healer herself, used to say that panic was a disease more dangerous than any wound, because it spread faster and killed more people. Elena had carried those words with her every day since she left home, and now, kneeling over a wolf whose life depended on her steady hands, she understood exactly what her mother meant. The wolf convulsed once, then went still. For a terrifying second, Elena thought she had lost him. She pressed her fingers to his neck, and felt a weak pulse, still fighting beneath the skin. "Stay with me," she murmured, not sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. It was in that moment, with her hands stained red and her focus narrowed to nothing but the wound in front of her, that the tent flap opened, and a presence stepped inside that made the air itself feel heavier. She did not look up right away. She could not afford to. But she felt it, the way the 2 remaining healers straightened instantly, the way even the wounded wolf on the table seemed to still further, as though some instinct recognized authority before conscious thought could. "Report," a low voice said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. "He will live if the bleeding stops," Elena answered without turning around, her attention locked on the wound. "I need silence, not reports." There was a pause, the kind of pause that made the healers behind her go rigid with fear, as though she had just committed some unthinkable offense. Elena barely noticed. She was too busy working, her fingers moving with practiced precision, tying off what needed to be tied, pressing what needed pressure, doing everything her training had taught her to keep one more soul from slipping away. Only when the bleeding finally slowed, only when she had stitched the last of the wound closed and covered it with clean cloth, did she allow herself to breathe out and sit back on her heels. That was when she turned and saw him. He stood near the entrance of the tent, tall enough that his shoulders nearly brushed the top of the canvas, dressed simply in dark clothing that bore no unnecessary decoration, yet somehow commanded more presence than any embroidered robe could have. His eyes were a shade of gray that reminded Elena of storm clouds right before they broke, and they were fixed directly on her, unreadable, assessing. She realized with a small jolt exactly who this was. Damien Ashford, King of Blackthorn. The man every healer, every servant, every warrior in the territory had warned her about, before she even finished unpacking her bags 2 days earlier. "He does not thank people," one of the younger apprentices had told her while showing her around the healing quarters. "He does not smile. Some say he has not smiled since his mate died, years ago. Just do your work, stay out of his way, and you will be fine." Elena had nodded politely at the time, filing the warning away without much thought. She had come to Blackthorn to learn, not to socialize with its ruler. But now, kneeling in a tent that smelled of blood and herbs, facing the very man everyone had cautioned her about, she found herself unable to look away from those storm-gray eyes. "You spoke to me like I was a nuisance," Damien said finally, his tone flat, giving nothing away. "You were standing in my light," Elena replied before she could stop herself. "And this wolf needed me more than you needed a report." A ripple of shock passed through the healers behind her. One of them actually gasped. Elena felt her stomach drop, wondering if she had just made an enormous mistake, the kind that could get her sent home in disgrace before her training had even properly begun. But Damien did not react with anger. Instead, something flickered across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, an expression Elena could not quite name. It was not offense. It was closer to surprise, as though no one had spoken to him so plainly in a very long time. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena," she said, straightening her spine, refusing to let her voice shake despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. Elena Whitmore. He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. Then he looked past her, toward the wolf resting on the table, his chest now rising and falling in a steady, even rhythm. "You saved Callum's life," Damien said. It was not quite a thank you, but it was close enough that the healers around them exchanged startled glances. "That is my job," Elena answered simply. Damien's gaze returned to her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The tent felt smaller somehow, the noise of the camp outside fading into the background, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat, oddly loud in her ears. Then he turned and left without another word, his coat sweeping behind him as he stepped back out into the gray light of early morning. The healers erupted into whispers the second he was gone. "He never comes into the healing tents," one of them said, eyes wide. "Never. Not even when his own brother was injured last winter." "And he asked your name," another added, staring at Elena like she had grown a second head. "The king never asks anyone's name unless they are already important." Elena did not know what to make of any of it. She wiped her hands clean, focused on finishing her work, and tried to push the strange encounter out of her mind. She had heard the warnings. Cold, heartless, unreachable since the loss of his mate. She had no reason to believe any of that had changed, simply because he asked her name once. And yet, as she moved between patients for the rest of that long, exhausting day, she found her thoughts drifting back to those storm-gray eyes, more often than she wanted to admit. By evening, the wounded had all been stabilized, and the healing tents finally quieted enough for Elena to sit down and eat something for the first time since dawn. She sat outside near a small fire with two other apprentices, Mara and Colin, both of whom had grown up within Blackthorn territory, and seemed to know every piece of gossip the pack had ever produced. "You really told the king to get out of your light?" Colin asked for the third time, grinning like it was the funniest thing he had heard all year. "I did not tell him to get out," Elena said, though a small smile tugged at her lips despite her tiredness. "I just said he was standing in it." "Same thing, from what I hear," Mara said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Nobody talks to him like that. Nobody." "Why not?" Elena asked, genuinely curious now. "He is still just a person." Mara and Colin exchanged a look, the kind of look that suggested Elena had a great deal to learn about her new home. "He was not always like this," Mara said quietly, glancing around as though checking that no one else could overhear. "My mother used to work in the main hall, years ago. She said he used to laugh. He used to walk through the village and talk to people, ask about their children, their harvests, small things like that. He was different." "What changed?" Elena asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "His mate," Colin said, his voice dropping lower. "She was killed, an attack from a rival pack, years back, before either of us were even old enough to understand what that meant. She was carrying his child at the time." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, an unexpected wave of sympathy for a man she barely knew. "Since then," Mara continued, "he has not let anyone close, not healers, not advisors, not even his own brother, from what people say. He rules well. The territory is safe, the borders are strong, but he does it all alone. Some say he built a wall around himself so thick that nothing can get through it anymore." Elena stared into the fire, thinking about the brief flicker of surprise she had seen cross his face earlier that day, the way he had lingered for just a moment longer than necessary before turning to leave. Maybe the wall was not as thick as everyone believed, or maybe she was simply imagining things after a long, exhausting day, seeing meaning in a look that meant nothing at all. Either way, she reminded herself firmly, it was not her concern. She had come to Blackthorn to learn healing, to grow her skills, to build a future for herself far from the small pack she had grown up in, where opportunities for someone of her low rank had always been limited. She had not come here looking for anything else, and she certainly had not come looking for the attention of a king everyone described as untouchable. She finished her meal in silence, said goodnight to Mara and Colin, and made her way to the small room she had been given near the healing quarters. Sleep came slowly that night, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over, the fear of nearly losing a patient, the strange tension of standing face to face with the king, the sympathy she felt upon learning about his past. Just as she finally began drifting towards sleep, a knock sounded at her door, soft but insistent. Elena sat up, confused, wondering who could possibly need her at such a late hour. She opened the door to find one of the palace guards standing there, his expression unreadable in the dim hallway light. "The king wishes to see you," he said simply. "Now." Elena's heart skipped, a strange mixture of nerves and curiosity flooding through her all at once. She had no idea what could possibly warrant a late-night summons from a man everyone insisted never wanted anything to do with anyone. But she pulled on her cloak, steadied her breathing, and followed the guard down the quiet corridors, wondering what exactly waited for her at the end of them, and whether her first impression of the so-called Heartless King of Blackthorn had been wrong all along. The corridors of the main hall were quiet at this hour, lit only by scattered torches that threw long shadows across the stone walls. Elena had not yet seen much of the palace beyond the healing quarters, and despite her nerves, she could not help noticing the simple beauty of the place, the way the architecture favored strength over decoration, much like the man who ruled it. The guard led her to a set of heavy wooden doors, and knocked once before pushing them open. Inside was a study lined with shelves of old books and maps, a fire crackling in the hearth, and Damien standing near the window with his back to her, looking out at the dark grounds beyond. "You wanted to see me," Elena said, keeping her voice steady even though her pulse was racing. Damien did not turn immediately. "Callum is my cousin," he said quietly. "Not just a warrior under my command, my cousin." Elena blinked, surprised by the admission. "I did not know that." "Few outside the family do," Damien said, finally turning to face her. In the firelight, his eyes looked less like storm clouds and more like something softer, something almost vulnerable, though his expression remained carefully controlled. "I have lost enough people in my life, Elena Whitmore. I did not intend to lose him today." "You did not lose him," Elena said gently. "He is resting, and he will recover fully within a few weeks." "Because of you," Damien said. It was not a question. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks again, unsure how to respond to praise from a man who, according to everyone she had spoken with, never offered any. "I only did what any healer would have done." "No," Damien said, shaking his head slightly. "The other healers hesitated. You did not. There is a difference between knowledge and courage, and you have both." The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, charged with something neither of them acknowledged aloud. Elena found herself studying his face, searching for the coldness everyone had described, and finding instead a tiredness that ran far deeper than a single sleepless night could explain. "Why did you really call me here?" Elena asked, deciding that whatever caution she should feel around a king mattered less than her curiosity. "You could have thanked me in the tent, in front of everyone. You chose to wait until we were alone." Something shifted in Damien's expression, a flicker of surprise, as though he had not expected her to notice, or perhaps had not expected anyone to call attention to it so directly. "I do not know," he admitted after a long pause, and the honesty in his voice caught Elena off guard. "Perhaps I wanted to see if the woman who spoke to me so boldly in that tent was as unafraid outside of it." "And am I?" Elena asked, lifting her chin slightly. A ghost of something that might have almost been a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone before it could fully form. "It appears so." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, simply held his gaze across the dimly lit study, feeling something pass between them that she could not name and was not entirely sure she wanted to. "You should rest," Damien said finally, breaking the moment, his voice returning to its usual controlled tone, though something in it lingered softer than before. "Tomorrow the healing tents will be full again. You will need your strength." "And you?" Elena asked before she could stop herself. "Will you rest as well?" Damien's eyes met hers, and for just a moment, the careful mask he wore seemed to crack, revealing something raw and exhausted underneath. Kings do not often have that luxury. Elena wanted to say something more, wanted to push past the walls she could sense him building even as they spoke, but she reminded herself that she barely knew this man, that everything she had heard about him painted a picture of someone who did not welcome closeness, no matter how the last few minutes had felt. "Good night, then," she said instead, offering a small, respectful bow before turning to leave. "Elena," Damien said, just as she reached the door. She turned back, waiting. "Thank you," he said simply, the words seeming to cost him something, as though gratitude itself was a language he had nearly forgotten how to speak. For Callum. And for not backing down today, when everyone else did. Elena felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words. You are welcome, my king. She left the study and made her way back to her small room, her mind spinning with everything that had happened since dawn. The terror of nearly losing a patient, the strange, quiet intensity of the man everyone called Heartless, the way his eyes had softened just slightly when he thought no one was watching closely enough to notice. She did not know what to make of any of it. She only knew that whatever she had expected when she arrived in Blackthorn 2 days earlier, it had not been this strange, unexpected pull toward a man everyone insisted was incapable of feeling anything at all. As she finally drifted into sleep that night, Elena could not shake the memory of his eyes in the firelight, or the quiet ache in his voice, when he admitted that kings did not often have the luxury of rest. Whatever walls he had built around himself, she was beginning to suspect they were not built from indifference, but from grief so deep it had never truly healed. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, dangerous thought took root, one she was not yet ready to examine too closely. She wanted to know more. She wanted to understand the man behind the mask, the king everyone feared but few truly knew. She fell asleep still wondering what tomorrow would bring, unaware that her arrival in Blackthorn had already set something in motion that neither she nor Damien would be able to stop. The days that followed the attack on Blackthorn's border moved quickly, filled with the steady rhythm of healing work that left Elena little time to think about anything beyond the next wound she needed to close, or the next fever she needed to break. Callum's recovery continued well, his strength returning day by day, and the rest of the wounded warriors slowly returned to their duties, one by one, until the healing tents finally began to empty. Elena told herself that the strange encounter with Damien in his study had been nothing more than a moment of exhaustion and adrenaline on both their parts, a brief crack in his usual composure caused by fear for his cousin's life. She reminded herself of this every time her thoughts drifted back to the sound of his voice, admitting that kings did not often have the luxury of rest, or the way his eyes had softened in the firelight when he thanked her. It did not stop her thoughts from drifting there anyway. A week after the attack, Elena was sent to the northern training grounds to assist with routine checkups for the warriors stationed there, a task usually reserved for more senior healers, but assigned to her after the head healer noted her calm handling of the crisis the week before. She welcomed the assignment, grateful for the chance to prove herself further, and set off early in the morning with her supply bag slung over her shoulder. The training grounds stretched wide and open, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the cool morning air. Warriors moved through drills in organized groups, the sound of weapons clashing, and instructors shouting corrections filling the space with constant motion and noise. Elena found a quiet spot near the edge of the field to set up her supplies, ready to treat the usual assortment of minor injuries that training always produced. She had been working for perhaps an hour, wrapping a sprained wrist for a young warrior named Finn, when she felt a familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the same sensation she had felt in the healing tent the week before. She looked up and found Damien standing near the edge of the training field, watching the drills with his arms crossed, dressed in simple training clothes rather than the formal attire she had seen him wearing before. He looked different like this, less like a distant king, and more like a man who understood exactly what it meant to fight, to train, to bleed alongside the people he led. Elena watched him for a moment longer than she probably should have, noting the easy way he moved when he stepped forward to correct a young warrior's stance, adjusting the angle of the boy's arm with practiced precision before stepping back again. He trains with them sometimes, Finn said quietly, following her gaze. Not often anymore, but sometimes. My father used to say the king was the best fighter in 3 territories, back before everything happened. Before what happened? Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. Before his mate, Finn said simply, and Elena nodded, not needing further explanation. She finished wrapping Finn's wrist and sent him back to his training group, then busied herself organizing her supplies, trying not to look toward the edge of the field too often. It did not work particularly well. Every few minutes her eyes seemed to find him again, drawn by some force she could not quite explain. It was nearly midday when Damien finally approached her, his expression unreadable as he crossed the field toward her small station beneath the shade of a large oak tree. "How is Callum's recovery progressing?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested this was not truly why he had crossed the field. "Very well," Elena answered, standing to greet him properly. He should be back to full duty within another week. Damien nodded, glancing briefly toward the training grounds where the warriors continued their drills. "Good. He is stubborn. He would have tried to return sooner if you had allowed it." "I did not allow it," Elena said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "He tried anyway. I had to threaten to tell his mother." For the second time since she had met him, Elena saw something close to amusement flicker across Damien's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. That would work. Aunt Lorna does not tolerate foolishness from any of us, myself included. "You have an aunt who scares even you?" Elena asked, genuinely surprised. "Everyone has someone who scares them," Damien said, his tone growing quieter, more thoughtful. "Even kings." Elena studied him for a moment, wondering what exactly frightened a man who ruled an entire territory with such quiet, unshakable authority. She did not ask, sensing that some questions needed to wait for trust to build further before they could be spoken aloud. "You watch the training drills often?" she asked instead, changing the subject to something safer. "I try to," Damien said. "A king who forgets what it feels like to fight alongside his people quickly becomes a king who cannot lead them properly. It is easy to lose that connection, sitting behind desks and making decisions from a distance. I refuse to let that happen, no matter how much easier it might be." There was something admirable in that answer, Elena thought, a dedication to his role that went beyond simple duty, something closer to genuine care for the people under his protection, despite the cold reputation everyone insisted he carried. "The healers speak of you as though you are made of stone," Elena said before she could stop herself, curiosity overriding her usual caution. "Yet everything I have seen so far suggests otherwise." Damien's expression shifted slightly, something guarded entering his eyes. "People believe what is easiest to believe. Stone does not disappoint anyone. Stone does not fail to protect the people it loves." The words carried weight far beyond their simple meaning, and Elena understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what he was referring to. His mate. The loss that had reshaped him into the man everyone now feared and misunderstood in equal measure. "You did not fail her," Elena said softly, unsure where the boldness to speak such words came from, only knowing that she needed to say them. "Whatever happened, it was not your failure." Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena worried she had pushed too far, crossed some invisible line that would send him retreating back behind the careful walls he had built. But instead, he simply looked at her, his storm-gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You know nothing about what happened," he said quietly, though there was no anger in his voice, only a deep, worn exhaustion that spoke of years spent carrying a weight too heavy for one person alone. "Then tell me," Elena said, surprising herself with the invitation. For a long moment, she thought he might actually do it, might finally open the door he had kept locked for so long. His eyes held hers, something vulnerable flickering just beneath the surface, and Elena found herself holding her breath, waiting. Then a horn sounded from across the training grounds, signaling the end of the morning drills, and the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. Damien straightened, the careful mask sliding back into place, as though it had never slipped at all. "I have matters to attend to," he said, his voice returning to its usual controlled tone. "Thank you for your work with the warriors today." He turned and walked away before Elena could respond, leaving her standing beneath the oak tree, with her heart racing, and 1,000 unanswered questions swirling through her mind. That evening, as she made her way back to the healing quarters, Elena found Mara waiting for her near the entrance, an excited expression on her face that immediately put Elena on alert. "You spoke with the king again," Mara said, not quite a question. "At the training grounds, everyone is talking about it." "It was nothing," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. "He asked about Callum's recovery." "For 20 minutes?" Mara asked, raising an eyebrow. "Elena, the king does not linger anywhere for 20 minutes, unless something important is happening. People are starting to notice." Elena felt a flush of embarrassment rise in her cheeks. "There is nothing to notice. I am a healer. He is concerned about his cousin, that is all." Mara did not look convinced, but she let the subject drop, and Elena was grateful for it. She retreated to her small room that night, exhausted from the day's work, but unable to quiet her thoughts enough to sleep easily. She kept returning to the moment in the training grounds, the way Damien's eyes had held hers, the vulnerability she had glimpsed just before the horn sounded, and pulled him back into his role as king. She told herself, once again, that it meant nothing, that she was simply imagining connections where none truly existed, but deep down, a small, persistent voice whispered otherwise, suggesting that whatever walls Damien Ashford had built around his heart, they were not nearly as solid as everyone believed. Over the following days, their paths crossed more frequently than Elena could attribute to simple coincidence. He appeared at the healing quarters when minor injuries needed attention that certainly did not require a king's presence. He found reasons to walk through the training grounds whenever Elena was assigned there. Small moments accumulated between them, quiet conversations exchanged in passing, brief glances held a heartbeat longer than necessary, until even Elena could no longer convince herself that nothing was happening. The pack noticed too. Whispers followed Elena through the corridors, curious glances from warriors and healers alike, all wondering the same thing she found herself wondering late at night, when sleep refused to come. What exactly was happening between the healer's apprentice and the king, everyone believed incapable of feeling anything at all? Elena did not have an answer. She only knew that something had shifted since her arrival in Blackthorn, some quiet unraveling of the careful control Damien wore like armor, and she found herself wanting, despite every warning she had received, to be there when the last of that armor finally fell away completely. Autumn settled over Blackthorn territory, with a chill that crept into every corner of the palace, turning the leaves along the training grounds into shades of gold and deep red. Elena had now been in Blackthorn for nearly a month, and the rhythm of her days had settled into something familiar. Healing quarters in the mornings, evenings spent studying old medical texts with the senior healers, and, more often than she cared to admit even to herself, small unexpected moments spent in the company of the king. She had stopped trying to explain those moments away as coincidence. There were simply too many of them, too consistent, too deliberate, in ways that left little room for doubt. Damien sought her out. She did not fully understand why, given everything she had heard about him before she ever arrived, but she had stopped questioning it as fiercely as she once had. On this particular evening, Elena found herself walking through the palace gardens after a long day, treating a stubborn fever that had spread through several of the younger pack members. The gardens were quiet at this hour, most of the staff having retired for the night, leaving only the soft sound of wind moving through the last of the autumn leaves, and the distant call of some night bird settling into its roost. She was not entirely surprised to find Damien there, seated on a stone bench near a small fountain, staring at nothing in particular with an expression far more troubled than she had seen on him before. "You are out late," Elena said, approaching cautiously, unsure whether her presence would be welcomed or not. Damien looked up, and something in his eyes shifted immediately upon seeing her, a small flicker of relief that he seemed to try, unsuccessfully, to hide. "I could say the same of you." "Fevers do not keep polite hours," Elena said, settling onto the bench beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool evening air, but not so close as to seem presumptuous. "Is the child well?" Damien asked, and Elena felt a small surge of warmth at the question, at the fact that he remembered exactly what had occupied her day without needing to be told. "She will recover," Elena said. "The fever broke an hour ago. Her mother is with her now." Damien nodded, falling silent again, his gaze drifting back toward the fountain, watching the water catch what little moonlight filtered through the clouds above. "You seem troubled tonight," Elena said carefully, unsure whether to push further or allow him the silence he seemed to be seeking. For a long moment, she thought he might simply deflect the question as he usually did, retreating behind the careful composure that had protected him for so many years. Instead, he surprised her. "Today marks 8 years," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Elena's chest tighten in response. She did not need to ask what he meant. She understood immediately, the date settling into place alongside everything Mara and Colin had told her weeks earlier. "Her name was Rosalind," Damien continued, as though something inside him had finally given way, the words spilling out after being held back for far too long. "She used to sit in this exact garden every evening after her duties were finished. She said the fountain reminded her of her childhood home, near a lake where her family used to gather every summer." Elena remained silent, sensing that he needed the space to continue without interruption, that whatever door had finally cracked open needed to be allowed to swing wide on its own. "We were expecting our first child," Damien said, his voice growing rougher, though his composure remained remarkably steady given the weight of what he was sharing. Rosalind had already chosen a name. She refused to tell anyone, said it needed to remain a secret until the day she was born. "What happened?" Elena asked softly, though she already suspected the general shape of the answer. "A rival pack crossed our borders during a supply run," Damien said, his hands tightening slightly where they rested on his knees. "Rosalind was traveling with a small escort to visit her sister in a neighboring village. The attack was swift. Our warriors arrived too late to save any of them." Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, aching with sympathy for the man beside her, for the grief he had carried alone for 8 long years, hidden behind walls so carefully constructed that an entire territory had come to believe he simply did not feel anything at all. "I was not there," Damien continued, his voice dropping even lower. "I was here, in this palace, handling territorial disputes that seemed important at the time, and mean absolutely nothing to me now. If I had gone with her, if I had insisted on a larger escort, if I had simply paid closer attention to the warnings our scouts had given about increased activity near the border, she might still be here. My daughter might still be here." "You could not have known," Elena said gently, reaching out instinctively to rest her hand over his, surprised by her own boldness but unable to stop herself. "You cannot carry the blame for something you had no way of predicting." Damien looked down at her hand covering his, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the contact sending a warmth through Elena that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. "Everyone tells me that," Damien said quietly. "My advisors, my family, even Rosalind's own mother, before she passed 2 years later. Everyone insists it was not my fault, and yet the guilt remains, no matter how many times I hear those words." "Guilt does not always listen to logic," Elena said, thinking of her own mother's teachings about grief, about the way it settled into the body, regardless of what the mind understood to be true. "It settles in and stays, no matter how unreasonable it might be." Damien turned his hand beneath hers, and their fingers intertwined without either of them consciously deciding to allow it. "You understand grief well, for someone so young." "My father passed when I was 12, Elena said, the admission surprising even herself, given how rarely she spoke of it to anyone. "A hunting accident. Nothing dramatic or tied to pack conflicts. Simply a terrible piece of luck that took him from us far too soon. My mother never fully recovered. Not truly. She continued living, continued working as a healer, but some part of her closed off after that, and I do not believe it ever fully opened again." "I am sorry," Damien said, his thumb moving gently across the back of her hand in a small, comforting gesture that sent a shiver through her entire body. "As am I for your loss," Elena said, meeting his eyes in the dim moonlight. "For Rosalind, for your daughter. No one should have to carry that kind of weight alone for as long as you have." Something shifted in Damien's expression then, a vulnerability so raw that Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. "I did not intend to tell anyone this," he admitted. "I have not spoken her name aloud to another person in over a year." "Why tell me?" Elena asked, genuinely curious, genuinely wanting to understand what had changed, what had made this particular evening, this particular moment, feel different enough to break through 8 years of careful silence. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "I do not fully know," he said finally, his honesty catching her off guard, as it so often did with him. "There is something about you, Elena Whitmore, something that makes the walls I have spent years building feel considerably less necessary." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them seemed ready to fully acknowledge. Elena felt her pulse quicken, uncertain what to say, uncertain whether the growing warmth in her chest was something she should embrace or something she needed to guard against, given everything she had heard about the dangers of losing herself to a man still so clearly haunted by his past. "I should not have burdened you with this," Damien said after a moment, seeming to catch himself, the familiar guarded expression beginning to slide back into place across his features. "You did not burden me," Elena said quickly, tightening her fingers around his before he could pull away entirely. "I am glad you told me. Grief carried alone grows heavier with every passing year. Perhaps it is time you allowed someone to help you carry it, even just a little. Damien looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his storm-gray eyes. Then, slowly, carefully, as though testing whether the moment would shatter beneath the weight of the gesture, he lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to the back of hers. "Thank you," he said softly, "for listening, for not treating my grief as a weakness to be managed, but simply as a burden to be shared." Elena felt warmth spread through her entire body at the gesture, at the quiet sincerity in his voice. Whatever careful distance she had maintained since arriving in Blackthorn, whatever caution she had tried to hold on to regarding a man everyone insisted was incapable of true feeling, it felt increasingly difficult to maintain in moments like this. Moments that revealed exactly how much feeling remained buried beneath his careful composure. They sat together in the garden for a long while after that, the conversation drifting into quieter topics, small stories from their respective childhoods, favorite memories, simple things that helped rebuild a sense of ease between them after the weight of what had been shared. By the time Elena finally returned to her room that night, the moon had risen high above the palace, and her heart felt fuller than it had in a very long time, though she could not yet name exactly what that fullness meant. She only knew that something had changed between them in that garden, some quiet shift that neither of them could easily undo, and she found herself wondering, as she finally drifted off to sleep, what exactly waited for them both on the path they seemed to be slowly, cautiously beginning to walk together. The annual gathering ceremony arrived 3 weeks after that quiet evening in the garden, a tradition Elena had heard described in reverent tones by nearly everyone in Blackthorn since her arrival. Once each year, under the light of the full moon, the entire pack gathered in the great clearing beyond the training grounds to celebrate the turning of the season, to honor those who had passed, and to welcome any new members who had joined the pack throughout the year. Elena had not expected to attend, given her status as merely an apprentice healer still completing her training, but Mara had insisted, dragging her along despite her protests, that she had nothing appropriate to wear for such an important occasion. "Nonsense," Mara had said, pulling a simple but elegant dress from her own wardrobe and thrusting it into Elena's arms. "Everyone attends the gathering ceremony. It would be strange for you not to be there, especially now." "What do you mean, especially now?" Elena had asked, though something in Mara's knowing smile suggested she understood exactly what her friend was implying. The clearing, when Elena finally arrived that evening, took her breath away. Torches lined the perimeter, their flames dancing gently in the cool night air, while the full moon hung directly overhead, bathing the entire gathering in silver light. Hundreds of pack members had assembled, dressed in their finest clothing, their voices creating a low, comfortable hum of conversation and laughter that filled the clearing with warmth despite the autumn chill. Elena found a spot near the edge of the gathering, alongside Mara and Colin, watching as the ceremony began with traditional songs and a formal welcome from several of the pack elders. She had never witnessed anything quite like it, the sense of unity and belonging that seemed to radiate from every corner of the clearing, and she found herself swept up in the beauty of the tradition, despite her initial nerves about attending. It was nearly an hour into the ceremony when Damien appeared, stepping into the clearing dressed in formal attire that Elena had never seen him wear before, dark fabric embroidered with subtle silver thread that caught the moonlight with every movement. A hush fell over the gathering as he approached the center of the clearing, the pack turning, as one to face their king, with obvious respect and affection. He spoke for several minutes, formal words of gratitude for another year of safety and prosperity within the territory, acknowledgement of those who had been lost throughout the year, and a solemn promise to continue protecting the pack with everything he possessed. Elena listened, struck by the ease with which he commanded the space, the quiet authority that had nothing to do with volume or force, and everything to do with genuine respect earned through years of dedicated leadership. When his gaze finally found hers across the crowded clearing, something shifted in the air between them, a pull so sudden and undeniable that Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. She had heard about mate bonds before, of course. Every wolf grew up hearing stories about the moment when two souls recognized each other beneath the moon, an instinctive connection that ran deeper than simple attraction, deeper than choice itself. She had never expected to experience it herself, certainly not with the king of an entire territory, and definitely not in the middle of a formal ceremony, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. But there was no mistaking the sensation that flooded through her as their eyes met across the clearing, a warmth that started somewhere deep in her chest and spread outward until it seemed to reach every part of her body, an inexplicable certainty that something ancient and unshakable had just clicked into place. Judging by the way Damien froze mid-sentence, his formal address stumbling to an abrupt halt, he felt it too. A murmur rippled through the gathered pack, confusion and surprise evident on nearly every face as they tried to understand what had caused their king to suddenly lose his composure in the middle of such an important ceremony. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks as attention began shifting toward her, following the direction of Damien's stunned gaze. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the entire clearing seeming to hold its breath alongside them. Then Damien's expression shifted, something like panic flashing behind his storm-gray eyes, before he forcibly composed himself, tearing his gaze away from Elena and clearing his throat to continue the ceremony, as though nothing had happened at all. Elena stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding, the warmth that had flooded through her moments earlier now tangled with confusion and a growing sense of dread. She understood exactly what had just occurred, and judging by Damien's reaction, so did he. But instead of the joy such recognition was supposed to bring, she had felt only his fear, sharp and immediate, radiating across the clearing before he shut it down entirely. "Did you feel that?" Mara whispered beside her, eyes wide with astonishment. "Elena, everyone felt that. That was a bond recognition. You and the king, you just—" "I know what it was," Elena said quietly, her voice tighter than she intended, watching as Damien finished his address with visible effort, his usual commanding presence noticeably strained for the remainder of the ceremony. The moment the formal proceedings concluded, Damien turned and disappeared into the crowd, moving with a speed that made it clear he had no intention of allowing anyone, especially Elena, the chance to speak with him. She watched him go, a hollow feeling spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the cool night air, and everything to do with the unmistakable rejection she had just witnessed. She did not chase after him. Whatever pride remained within her refused to allow it, refused to let her go running after a man who had just publicly fled from the very connection every wolf was supposed to treasure above all else. The rest of the gathering ceremony passed in a blur for Elena, the earlier joy of the evening, replaced by a confusing mixture of hurt and anger that she could not quite untangle. She made polite conversation when necessary, but her thoughts remained fixed on the moment their eyes had met, on the fear she had felt radiating from him in that instant, so strong it had overwhelmed whatever else the bond might have offered. She returned to her room late that night, exhausted and emotionally drained, only to find a folded piece of parchment slipped beneath her door. She picked it up with trembling hands, recognizing the elegant, careful handwriting immediately. "Elena," the note read, "I understand you likely have questions about what occurred this evening. I owe you an explanation, though I fear it will not be one you wish to hear. Please meet me in my study tomorrow morning, if you are willing. Damien." Elena stared at the note for a long time, before finally setting it aside, uncertain whether she was willing to hear whatever explanation waited for her, uncertain whether her heart could withstand hearing him confirm, in plain words, that he had no intention of accepting the bond fate had chosen between them. She barely slept that night, her mind replaying the moment of recognition over and over, the warmth of connection immediately followed by the cold sting of his fear and retreat. By the time morning arrived, she had made her decision. Whatever he had to say, she deserved to hear it directly, rather than spending the rest of her time in Blackthorn wondering and imagining worse possibilities than whatever truth actually waited for her. She found him in his study exactly as his note had promised, standing near the same window where she had first spoken with him weeks earlier, his back rigid, his shoulders tense in a way she had not seen since her very first days in Blackthorn. "You came," he said, turning to face her, his expression carefully guarded once again, all traces of the vulnerability he had shown her in the garden, now hidden behind familiar walls. "You asked me to," Elena said simply, refusing to let her hurt show in her voice. Damien was quiet for a long moment, seeming to search for the right words, or perhaps simply steeling himself for whatever he intended to say. "What happened last night was real," he began finally. "I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. Our wolves recognized each other, a true mate bond." I understand what I felt, Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite the ache building in her chest. What I do not understand is why you ran from it as though it were something to fear. Because it is, Damien said, his composure cracking slightly, revealing the raw pain underneath. I have already lost one mate, Elena. I have already buried the future I thought I would have with her, along with the child we would never meet. I cannot survive that kind of loss again. I refuse to open myself to that possibility a second time. So your solution is to reject the bond entirely? Elena asked, disbelief coloring her voice. To pretend it did not happen, to push away the one thing fate has offered you, simply because you are afraid of a future that may never come to pass? It is not simply fear, Damien said, his voice rising slightly with frustration, though Elena sensed the anger was directed inward rather than at her. It is certainty. Every mate I care for becomes a target. Every person I allow close enough to matter becomes vulnerable to the same enemies who took Rosalind from me. I will not place you in that danger, Elena. I care for you too much to allow that to happen. The admission, buried within his refusal, struck Elena harder than she expected. He cared for her. He had just confirmed it, even as he simultaneously tried to close the door on whatever might grow between them. That should be my choice to make, Elena said quietly, fighting to keep her voice from breaking. Not yours alone. You do not get to decide what risks I am willing to accept simply because you have already decided you cannot survive losing someone again. I am the king of this territory, Damien said, though the words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. Protecting the people within it, including you, is my responsibility. Do not hide behind your title, Elena said, finally allowing some of her hurt to color her voice. This is not about protection. This is about fear, plain and simple. You are so terrified of losing someone again that you would rather deny yourself any chance at happiness entirely, and deny me the same, rather than risk feeling that pain a second time. Damien said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, rather than meeting her gaze directly. I will not chase a man who refuses to choose me, Elena said finally, straightening her spine, gathering whatever pride remained within her. I understand your grief, Damien. I have shown you compassion for it since the moment you shared it with me. But I will not spend my time in Blackthorn hoping you will eventually find the courage to accept what fate has already decided. That is not fair to either of us. She turned and left the study, without waiting for his response, her chest aching with a grief she had not expected to feel over a bond that had existed for less than a single day. She did not look back, though every instinct within her screamed to do exactly that, to turn around and see whether her words had affected him at all, whether the man who had shared his deepest pain with her in a quiet garden 3 weeks earlier might finally find the strength to fight for something rather than simply retreating from it. But pride, she reminded herself as she walked away, mattered too, and she refused to abandon what little remained of hers, no matter how deeply her heart ached with every step that carried her further from him. Winter arrived in Blackthorn earlier than usual that year, blanketing the training grounds and the palace gardens in a thin layer of frost that seemed to mirror the coldness settling between Elena and Damien in the weeks following their conversation in his study. What had once been a growing warmth, careful conversations and stolen moments of connection dissolved into a careful, painful distance that both of them seemed determined to maintain. Elena threw herself into her healing work, with a focus that bordered on obsessive, volunteering for extra shifts, studying late into the night, anything to keep her mind occupied and away from thoughts of storm-gray eyes and a bond she had no idea how to simply forget. Mara worried about her, she could tell, though her friend was careful not to push the subject too often, understanding perhaps that Elena needed time before she could speak about it comfortably. Damien, for his part, seemed to disappear into his duties with equal intensity. Reports filtered through the palace of increased border patrols, extended council meetings that stretched late into the evening, and a noticeable absence from any of the places Elena might reasonably be found. She told herself this was for the best, that distance would allow the ache in her chest to fade eventually, though 3 weeks into the arrangement, she had yet to feel any improvement at all. The political situation within the territory added further strain to an already difficult season. Word arrived that a neighboring pack, one that had grown increasingly aggressive over the past year, had begun testing Blackthorn's borders with small, probing incursions, never quite crossing into open conflict, but clearly searching for weaknesses to exploit. Elena learned most of this secondhand, through conversations overheard in the healing quarters, or gossip shared by Mara and Colin during their evening meals together. She had no direct role in territorial politics, of course, but the tension permeated every corner of the palace, an undercurrent of anxiety that made even routine healing work feel more urgent, more fraught with the possibility that any injury treated today might be a precursor to something far more serious. "They say it is the same pack that attacked years ago," Colin mentioned one evening, his voice lowered despite the relative privacy of their usual dining spot, "the one responsible for the king's mate." Elena's chest tightened at the mention, though she said nothing, simply continued eating her meal with far more focus than the simple task actually required. "My uncle serves in the border patrol," Colin continued, apparently unaware of the effect his words had on Elena. "He says the king has been relentless these past weeks, pushing the warriors harder than usual, personally overseeing patrol routes that used to be handled entirely by his captains. Something has him rattled." Elena thought of the bond that had flared between them at the gathering ceremony, of Damien's fear that anyone he cared for became a target for exactly the kind of danger now creeping along Blackthorn's borders. She wondered whether his renewed intensity stemmed from genuine territorial concern or from something closer to home, a fear that had only grown sharper since their conversation in his study. She did not have long to wonder. 3 days later, a summons arrived for all senior healers and their apprentices, calling them to an emergency briefing in the Great Hall regarding preparations for potential conflict along the northern border. Elena arrived alongside Mara, finding the hall already filled with warriors, healers and pack advisors, the atmosphere tense with barely restrained anxiety. Damien stood at the front of the room, flanked by several of his senior captains, his expression carved from the same careful stone she remembered from her very first days in Blackthorn, all traces of the vulnerability she had witnessed in the garden weeks earlier, now completely absent. "Our scouts have confirmed increased military presence along the northern border," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "The Thornwood pack has moved additional warriors into position over the past several days. While we do not yet have confirmation of hostile intent, we must prepare for the possibility of direct conflict." He continued for several minutes, outlining defensive strategies, assigning responsibilities to various captains and department heads, his tone remaining steady and controlled throughout, despite the gravity of what he was describing. Elena listened carefully alongside the other healers, taking note of instructions regarding emergency supply preparations and expanded healing tent capacity should conflict actually erupt. When the briefing finally concluded and the hall began to empty, Elena found herself lingering near the back, watching as Damien conferred quietly with his senior captains, his posture rigid with a tension that seemed to extend far beyond simple territorial concern. Their eyes met briefly across the emptying hall, and for a moment, Elena saw something flicker behind his careful composure, something that looked almost like an apology, or perhaps simply exhaustion too deep to fully hide. Then one of his captains spoke, drawing his attention away, and the moment passed. Elena left the hall with the other healers, her mind churning with worry that had little to do with territorial politics and everything to do with the man she had spent the past 3 weeks trying desperately not to think about. Over the following days, preparations for potential conflict consumed nearly every waking hour throughout the palace. Elena found herself working alongside the senior healers late into the night, organizing supplies, reviewing emergency protocols, preparing for a scenario none of them wanted to face but all understood might become necessary. Despite the demanding workload, or perhaps because of it, Elena caught glimpses of Damien more frequently than she had in the weeks since their painful conversation. He moved through the palace with restless energy, overseeing preparations personally, rather than delegating entirely to his captains. His presence felt in nearly every corner of Blackthorn, as the threat along the border continued to loom. One particularly late evening, as Elena finally finished organizing a fresh shipment of medical supplies, she found herself walking back toward the healing quarters, through nearly empty corridors, exhaustion weighing heavily on her limbs. She rounded a corner and nearly collided directly with Damien, who appeared equally exhausted, dark circles visible beneath his storm-gray eyes despite the dim torchlight. "Elena," he said, surprise evident in his voice, though he made no move to step around her and continue on his way. "My king," Elena said, falling back on formal address, the easy familiarity they had once shared feeling suddenly out of reach given everything that had happened between them. An awkward silence stretched between them, both seeming uncertain how to proceed given the careful distance they had maintained since their painful conversation weeks earlier. Elena noted the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the tension carried in his shoulders, and despite everything, felt a familiar pull of concern for his well-being that she could not quite suppress. "You are working too hard," she said finally, unable to stop herself from voicing the observation. "You need rest, same as anyone else." "I cannot afford rest right now," Damien said, though something in his tone suggested he appreciated the concern regardless of his response. "Not with Thornwood testing our borders so aggressively." "Even kings need sleep to think clearly," Elena said, echoing words her mother had often used with exhausted patience. "You will make better decisions rested than exhausted." Damien studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You still worry about my well-being, despite everything." "I am a healer," Elena said simply, though they both understood the response did not fully capture the truth of her feelings. "Concern for well-being is simply part of who I am, regardless of personal circumstances." Something in his expression softened slightly at her words, though the careful distance between them remained firmly in place. "Thank you, then, for your concern, healer." The formal title, spoken with such deliberate emphasis, struck Elena harder than she expected, a clear reminder of exactly the distance he intended to maintain between them, despite whatever bond fate had chosen to place there. "Of course," she said, matching his formality, though it cost her considerably more effort than she wanted to admit. "I hope the border situation resolves peacefully." "As do I," Damien said quietly, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer than strictly necessary, before he seemed to catch himself, straightening his posture, and stepping past her to continue down the corridor. "Good night, Elena." "Good night," she said softly, watching him go, the ache in her chest returning with familiar, unwelcome intensity. She continued to her room that night, curling beneath her blankets against the winter chill, her thoughts tangled between worry over the growing threat along Blackthorn's borders and the persistent, painful awareness of a bond neither of them seemed willing or able to simply set aside, regardless of how carefully they both tried to maintain their distance. Whatever conflict waited along the northern border, Elena suspected it would test far more than simple territorial boundaries in the days to come. It would test the walls Damien had built around his heart, walls that seemed to crack a little further with every unexpected encounter between them, no matter how determined he remained to keep them standing. A minor skirmish along the border 2 days later left several warriors with injuries requiring immediate attention, and Elena found herself once again in the healing tents late into the night, treating wounds while trying not to think too hard about how quickly the tension between Blackthorn and Thornwood had escalated. Fortunately, the skirmish had resulted in no fatalities, only a handful of injuries, serious enough to require overnight monitoring. But the incident confirmed everyone's worst fears regarding Thornwood's intentions. Elena was cleaning and dressing a deep gash along a young warrior's forearm when she heard familiar footsteps approaching the tent, footsteps she had come to recognize despite herself over the past several weeks. She did not look up immediately, focusing instead on finishing the careful stitching required to close the wound properly. "How bad is it?" Damien asked, his voice tight with barely controlled tension as he entered the tent. "He will recover fully," Elena said, tying off the final stitch before finally glancing up at him. What she saw made her breath catch, a fresh wound visible along his own temple, blood matted into his dark hair, a bruise already forming along his jaw. "You are injured," she said, immediately setting aside her supplies and moving toward him, professional instinct overriding whatever careful distance they had maintained over the past weeks. "It is nothing," Damien said, though he made no move to stop her as she reached up to examine the wound more closely. "It is not nothing," Elena said firmly, guiding him toward an empty section of the tent, her healer instincts fully engaged now, pushing past whatever awkwardness remained between them. "Sit. Let me look at this properly." Damien obeyed without further protest, settling onto a low bench while Elena retrieved fresh supplies, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, despite the way her heart raced at his proximity. She cleaned the wound carefully, noting that it would require several stitches to close properly, a fact that made her stomach twist with worry, despite her professional composure. "What happened out there?" she asked, focusing on threading her needle, rather than meeting his eyes directly. "Thornwood scouts crossed the border," Damien said, wincing slightly as she began the careful work of closing the wound. "A small group, testing our response time. We engaged before they could retreat, but they were better armed than expected." "You were leading the response personally," Elena said, not quite a question, though the answer was evident given his injury. "I do not send my warriors into danger. I am unwilling to face myself," Damien said simply. Elena continued her work in silence for several minutes, her focus narrowed entirely to the careful task of closing the wound, without causing unnecessary scarring. When she finally finished, she sat back, examining her work critically, before allowing herself to relax slightly. "You should be more careful," she said quietly, cleaning her hands with a nearby cloth. "Blackthorn needs its king alive and functioning, not risking himself unnecessarily in border skirmishes." "I am not reckless," Damien said, though something in his tone suggested he understood the deeper concern behind her words. "I simply refuse to ask my people to face dangers I am unwilling to face myself." "There is a difference between courage and recklessness," Elena said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since he had entered the tent. "I would prefer you remember that distinction, going forward." Something shifted in Damien's expression at her words, the careful composure he had maintained throughout their exchange, finally cracking slightly, revealing the exhaustion and strain underneath. "You still care what happens to me," he said quietly, "despite everything I said to you weeks ago." "Caring about your safety does not require accepting a mate bond," Elena said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, both of them understanding the deeper truth beneath her careful deflection. "I would extend the same concern to any patient under my care." "Would you?" Damien asked, his voice carrying a quiet challenge that made Elena's breath catch. She did not answer immediately, unable to find words that would adequately address the complicated tangle of emotions she still carried regarding him, despite weeks spent trying desperately to set those feelings aside. "Elena," Damien said softly, reaching out to gently take her hand, the gesture so unexpected that she found herself unable to pull away. "I have thought of little else these past weeks beyond our conversation in my study. I have watched you throw yourself into your work, watched you maintain careful distance whenever our paths crossed, and I have hated every moment of it, even though I forced that distance upon us myself." "Then why maintain it?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid of shattering whatever fragile honesty had finally emerged between them. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles across the back of her hand. "Because I am terrified," he admitted finally, the confession costing him something visible, a vulnerability so raw that Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Terrified that allowing myself to care for you as deeply as I already do will only lead to losing you as I lost Rosalind. Terrified that Thornwood's aggression along our borders is precisely the kind of danger I feared would follow any attempt to build something new." "Fear cannot be allowed to control every decision," Elena said gently, tightening her fingers around his. "If it does, you will spend the rest of your life alone, protecting yourself from a pain that may never actually come, while denying yourself any chance at happiness in the meantime." "I know that," Damien said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Logically, I understand exactly what you are saying, and yet the fear remains regardless, deeply rooted, refusing to simply release its hold no matter how much my mind insists it should." Elena reached up with her free hand, gently touching the uninjured side of his face, drawing his gaze to hers. "Grief reshapes us," she said softly, thinking again of her mother's careful teachings about loss and healing. "It does not disappear simply because time has passed, but it does not have to control every choice we make for the rest of our lives either. You are allowed to grieve Rosalind and your daughter completely, while still allowing yourself the possibility of happiness with someone else. The two things are not mutually exclusive, no matter how much guilt might try to convince you otherwise." Damien closed his eyes briefly at her words, leaning slightly into her touch, a gesture so unguarded that Elena felt her heart ache with tenderness for the pain he had carried alone for so many years. When he opened his eyes again, something had shifted in his expression, a softness she had never quite seen from him before. even during their quiet moment in the garden weeks earlier. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "I do not know how to allow myself to care for someone again without immediately fearing the worst. Every instinct within me screams to protect myself by maintaining distance, and yet every moment spent away from you these past weeks has felt like its own particular form of suffering." "Then perhaps we learn together," Elena said softly, offering the possibility carefully, unwilling to push him further than he was ready to go, but equally unwilling to abandon the fragile hope building within her chest. "Slowly, if necessary. There is no requirement to rush into anything neither of us feels ready for." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his features, as though he could not quite believe she remained willing to offer him patience, despite everything he had put her through over the past weeks. "You would be willing to do that, after everything I said to you, after the distance I forced between us?" "I understand fear, Damien," Elena said gently. "I understand grief, and the walls it builds around us. I am not asking you to simply abandon those walls overnight. I am only asking that you allow me the chance to help you slowly dismantle them, rather than continuing to hide behind them indefinitely." For a long moment, Damien said nothing, simply held her gaze, his hand still wrapped carefully around hers. Then, slowly, he lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her palm, the gesture so tender that Elena felt tears finally spill over, despite her best efforts to contain them. "Thank you," he said softly, "for your patience. For refusing to give up on me, despite every reason I have given you to do exactly that." Elena wiped at her tears with her free hand, offering him a small, genuine smile despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "I told you weeks ago that grief carried alone grows heavier with every passing year. I meant that, Damien. Whatever happens between us, I do not intend to let you carry this burden entirely alone anymore." The wound along his temple, now carefully stitched and cleaned, would heal within days, leaving barely a scar to mark the injury. But something else had shifted between them that night, in the quiet healing tent, something far more significant than a simple physical wound. A careful, tentative reopening of the connection that fate had chosen for them both weeks earlier, beneath the light of the full moon. Neither of them spoke further about what precisely their conversation meant for the future, both understanding that some things needed time to develop naturally, rather than being rushed into premature declarations. But when Elena finally returned to her room that night, her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks, carrying with it a fragile, hopeful warmth that she allowed herself, for the first time since the gathering ceremony, to fully embrace. The weeks following that quiet night in the healing tent brought a gradual, careful transformation to the relationship between Elena and Damien, one built on patience rather than urgency, on small gestures of trust rather than grand declarations. Elena noticed the changes first in the little things, the way Damien began seeking her out with a consistency that no longer felt hesitant or conflicted, the way his smiles, once so rare that entire seasons might pass without witnessing one, began appearing with increasing regularity whenever she was near. He walked her home from the healing quarters most evenings now, a habit that had started almost accidentally, born from a night when heavy snowfall made the palace corridors treacherous, and he had simply appeared to ensure she reached her room safely. What began as a single practical gesture soon became routine, both of them finding excuses to extend the short walk with unhurried conversation, neither willing to acknowledge aloud how much they had each come to anticipate these quiet moments together. The pack noticed, of course, as the pack always seemed to notice everything eventually. Whispers followed them through the corridors with renewed intensity, though the tone had shifted from confused curiosity to something closer to cautious hope. Even the most skeptical among the older healers, those who had known Damien since before Rosalind's death and had watched him retreat entirely into cold formality afterward, began commenting quietly on the change they observed in their king. "I have not seen him smile like that in 8 years, one of the senior healers remarked to Elena one afternoon, watching as Damien crossed the training grounds toward them, his expression noticeably lighter than the guarded composure he had worn for so long. "Whatever you are doing, child, do not stop." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks at the observation, though she could not deny the truth within it. Something had genuinely shifted between them, a warmth building steadily with each passing day, each shared conversation, each small moment of connection that neither of them seemed willing to interrupt. One particularly clear evening, As winter began giving way to the first hints of an early spring thaw, Damien found her in the palace gardens after her shift ended, the same quiet spot where he had first shared the truth about Rosalind months earlier. He carried something wrapped carefully in soft cloth, and Elena felt curiosity bloom as he settled beside her on the familiar stone bench. "I wanted to give you something," he said, his voice carrying a nervousness that seemed almost endearing, given how thoroughly composed he usually remained in every other aspect of his life. He carefully unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small, delicate pendant, silver metalwork shaped into the form of a wolf howling beneath a crescent moon. Simple, but clearly crafted, with considerable skill and care. "Damien, this is beautiful," Elena breathed, reaching out to touch the delicate metalwork gently. "You did not need to give me anything." "I wanted to," Damien said, his hands slightly unsteady as he lifted the pendant, silently asking permission, before carefully fastening it around her neck. "It belonged to my grandmother, originally. She always said it represented the courage required to howl into darkness, trusting that the moon would answer, even when the night felt overwhelming." Elena's fingers brushed against the pendant now resting against her chest, deeply moved by the significance of what he had chosen to share with her. "This is a family heirloom," she said softly. "Are you certain you wish for me to have it?" "I have never been more certain of anything," Damien said, his storm-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Elena, these past months, watching the careful way you approach everything, your patience, your studies, and myself, have shown me something I thought I had lost entirely 8 years ago." "What is that?" Elena asked softly, though some part of her already suspected the answer, hope building steadily in her chest. "The capacity to hope for a future beyond simple survival," Damien said, his voice carrying a raw honesty that never failed to move her deeply. "I spent 8 years convinced that duty and grief were all that remained available to me, that allowing myself to want more would only invite additional pain I could not survive a second time. You have shown me, slowly and patiently, that perhaps I was wrong about that." Elena felt tears building at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his words, by the transformation she had witnessed take place within him over the past several months. "Damien, let me finish," he said gently, reaching out to take her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles in a gesture that had become achingly familiar between them. "I am not asking you to make any promises tonight. I understand the bond between us frightened me initially, and I understand you deserve far more patience than I initially offered you. But I want you to know, clearly and without ambiguity, that I choose you, Elena, not because fate decided our wolves should recognize each other, but because every day spent alongside you has shown me exactly why my wolf made that choice in the first place." The confession settled over Elena like warm sunlight, breaking through months of accumulated winter cold, dissolving the last remnants of hurt she had carried since their painful conversation in his study, all those weeks earlier. She reached up, gently cupping his face with her free hand, drawing his gaze to meet hers directly. "I choose you as well," she said softly, the words carrying weight far beyond their simplicity. "I have, honestly, since that very first day in the healing tent, though I spent considerable time trying to convince myself otherwise, given everything I had heard about you before we ever properly met." A genuine smile spread across Damien's face then, transforming his features entirely, stripping away years of careful composure to reveal something younger, freer, closer to the man Mara had once described from years before Rosalind's death. "The healer who told her king he was standing in her light," he said, a warm teasing note entering his voice that Elena had never heard from him before. "That healer still stands by her assessment," Elena said, laughter bubbling up despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "You did need to move." Damien laughed then, a genuine unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even himself, his shoulders shaking with an amusement that had clearly been absent from his life for far too long. Elena watched him with wonder, treasuring the sight of this transformation she had somehow, gradually, helped bring about. "I intend to spend considerable time making up for the distance I forced between us," Damien said once his laughter subsided, his expression growing serious again, though the warmth in his eyes remained undiminished. "If you will allow me that opportunity." "I would like nothing more," Elena said softly. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, though nothing could have been further from her intention in that moment. When their lips finally met, gentle and unhurried, Elena felt the last remaining walls between them dissolve entirely, replaced by a warmth and certainty that settled deep into her very bones. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened steadily, both of them navigating the careful balance between Damien's continued responsibilities as king and the growing intimacy building between them. He introduced her formally to his family, including the stern but ultimately warm Aunt Lorna, who approved of Elena with a directness that left no room for doubt regarding her opinion. Finally, Lorna had said upon their introduction, studying Elena with sharp, assessing eyes before nodding once in clear satisfaction. I was beginning to think that boy had forgotten how to properly live, rather than simply survive. You have done well for him, child. Callum, fully recovered from his injuries months earlier, teased Damien mercilessly about the change in his cousin's demeanor, though the affection behind his teasing was evident to anyone paying attention. Even the pack elders, initially cautious about such an unexpected match between their king and a healer's apprentice of relatively low rank, gradually warmed to Elena as they witnessed the genuine transformation taking place within Damien. Despite the growing happiness building between them, the tension along Blackthorn's borders with Thornwood continued simmering beneath the surface, occasional skirmishes serving as constant reminders that their newfound joy existed within a world still fraught with danger. Damien remained vigilant regarding border security, though Elena noticed he no longer threw himself into that vigilance with the same reckless intensity he had displayed weeks earlier, seeming to have found a healthier balance between duty and personal well-being. "You are different now," Elena observed one evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens, the first genuine warmth of early spring beginning to soften the lingering winter chill. Lighter, somehow, despite everything still happening along the border. "I have something worth protecting again," Damien said simply, drawing her closer against his side as they walked. "Not simply duty or obligation, but genuine happiness. It changes how a person carries themselves through difficulty, I think." Elena leaned into his warmth, treasuring the simple comfort of the moment, unaware of how quickly that fragile happiness would be tested by dangers neither of them could fully anticipate, waiting just beyond the borders they had worked so hard to protect. Spring arrived fully across Blackthorn territory, transforming the palace gardens into a riot of color that seemed to mirror the happiness Elena carried within her own heart. 3 months had passed since Damien had given her his grandmother's pendant in that quiet garden conversation. 3 months of steadily building trust and affection that had transformed both of them in ways neither had fully anticipated. Elena had continued her healing studies throughout this time, recently earning promotion to full healer status after successfully completing her final assessments, a milestone she had celebrated alongside Damien and her closest friends, with genuine joy. Her responsibilities had expanded considerably, including occasional assignments to treat pack members living in villages scattered throughout the outer regions of Blackthorn's territory, work that took her beyond the palace walls more frequently than her apprenticeship duties previously had. It was one such assignment that found her traveling toward a small village near the eastern border on a bright spring morning, accompanied by only a single guard as escort, the route considered safe given its distance from the more contested northern border, where Thornwood's aggression had continued simmering throughout the winter months. The village elder had sent word requesting assistance with an outbreak of a persistent illness affecting several younger pack members, a request Elena had eagerly accepted, given her growing expertise treating exactly such conditions. Damien had expressed some hesitation about her traveling even this relatively short distance given the general political tension throughout the territory, but Elena had reassured him that the eastern border remained peaceful, entirely removed from the ongoing tension with Thornwood along the north. She should have paid closer attention to that hesitation. The journey to the village passed uneventfully, and Elena spent the better part of the day treating the affected children, her expertise and calm demeanor easing both their symptoms and their worried parents' anxiety considerably. By the time she finished her work, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest path that would carry her back toward the palace. "We should leave now, if we wish to arrive back before full darkness," her guard, a young warrior named Edwin, suggested as she gathered her supplies. Elena agreed, eager to return home and share the successful outcome of her work with Damien, who she knew had been quietly anxious throughout the day despite his attempts to hide it behind his usual composed exterior. They set off along the forest path at a steady pace, the fading afternoon light filtering gently through the canopy overhead. They were perhaps halfway back to the palace when Elena first sensed something wrong, an unnatural stillness settling over the forest that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Edwin seemed to notice it as well, his posture shifting immediately into alertness, his hand moving instinctively toward the blade secured at his side. "Stay close," he murmured, scanning the surrounding trees with sharp, careful attention. The attack, when it came, arrived with terrifying speed. 4 warriors emerged from the surrounding forest, their markings immediately identifying them as Thornwood pack members, their expressions carrying a cold determination that left no doubt regarding their intentions. Edwin moved to intercept them, positioning himself protectively between Elena and the approaching threat, but 4 against 1 offered impossibly poor odds, even for a skilled warrior. Elena watched in horror as he fought valiantly, managing to wound 2 of their attackers, before a blade found its mark across his shoulder, dropping him to the ground with a pained cry. "Run!" he gasped, struggling to rise despite his injury. "Elena, run!" She hesitated only a moment, torn between the instinct to help him and the growing certainty that remaining would accomplish nothing beyond ensuring both of them fell to this ambush. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with desperate speed, her heart pounding as she heard footsteps pursuing close behind. She did not get far. A hand closed around her arm, yanking her backward with brutal force, and she found herself facing one of the Thornwood warriors directly, his expression carrying satisfaction that made her stomach twist with fear. "The king's precious healer," he said, his voice carrying a mocking edge that sent ice through her veins. "Word travels quickly, even across contested borders. He will feel this loss deeply, I imagine." Elena struggled desperately against his grip, but he was considerably stronger, and before she could break free, she felt a sharp pain along her side, a blade finding its mark with precise, deliberate cruelty. She gasped, the pain overwhelming, spreading rapidly through her body in a way that felt distinctly wrong, far worse than a simple wound should feel. "Wolfsbane," the warrior said, releasing her as she stumbled backward, his voice carrying grim satisfaction. "A gift for your king, healer. Let him know exactly what it costs to care for someone within Thornwood's reach." Elena collapsed to the forest floor as the warriors retreated, the poison already spreading rapidly through her system, her vision beginning to blur at the edges. She heard Edwin's voice somewhere nearby, weak but insistent, calling her name, though the sound seemed to grow increasingly distant with each passing moment. She was not entirely certain how much time passed before help arrived. She remembered fragments, Edwin somehow dragging himself toward her despite his own injuries, applying pressure to her wound with shaking hands, his voice growing increasingly desperate as her responses became slower and less coherent. She remembered the sound of approaching horses, shouted voices, strong arms lifting her carefully from the forest floor. And she remembered, just before darkness finally claimed her entirely, storm-gray eyes filled with a terror she had never witnessed there before, and a voice, rough with barely controlled panic, repeating her name over and over, as though the words alone might be enough to keep her tethered to consciousness. "Elena, Elena, stay with me. Please, stay with me." Then darkness claimed her completely, and she knew nothing more. Damien had been standing at the palace gates when the scouts first raised the alarm, some instinct within him already gripped by unease throughout the entire day, despite Elena's reassurances that the eastern route remained safe. When the wounded guard, Edwin, stumbled into view supporting Elena's limp form between 2 mounted warriors who had found them on the forest path, Damien felt the ground shift beneath him in a way he had not experienced since the day he learned of Rosalind's death. He crossed the distance to the returning party before anyone could properly dismount, gathering Elena carefully into his own arms, her skin already carrying an unnatural pallor, her breathing shallow and labored in a way that sent immediate, overwhelming panic surging through him. "What happened?" he demanded, though the words came out rough, barely controlled, as he carried her toward the palace, at a pace that left the accompanying warriors struggling to keep up. "Thornwood ambush," Edwin managed, clutching his own injured shoulder as he hurried alongside. "4 of them, my king. They used wolfsbane on her blade wound, deliberately. They said it was meant as a message for you." Something dark and dangerous flickered behind Damien's eyes at the confirmation. A fury he had not allowed himself to feel in years, rising swiftly to the surface, though it remained secondary in this moment to the overwhelming terror gripping his chest, as he felt Elena's pulse fluttering weak and irregular beneath his fingers. "Get the healers!" he shouted, as they reached the palace entrance, his voice carrying an authority and desperation that sent every servant and guard within earshot scrambling immediately into action. "Now. Immediately. I do not care what they are doing. I need them in the healing quarters this instant." He carried Elena himself, refusing to relinquish her to anyone else, despite offers of assistance, his long strides, carrying them swiftly through the palace corridors, toward the healing quarters, where, only months earlier, Elena herself had fought so desperately to save his cousin's life. The bitter irony of the situation was not lost on him, even amid his overwhelming fear. He laid her carefully on the same table where he had first watched her work with such calm, steady confidence, her dark hair now spread across the pillow in stark contrast to the alarming pallor of her skin. Senior healers arrived within moments, immediately assessing the wound and beginning the urgent work of counteracting the wolfsbane poison now spreading rapidly through her system. Damien refused to leave her side, standing at the edge of the healing table, despite the healers' initial attempts to usher him away to allow them working space. When one particularly bold apprentice suggested he might be more comfortable waiting elsewhere, the look he turned on her silenced any further suggestion immediately. "I am not leaving," he said, his voice carrying no room for argument, though beneath the authority, something raw and desperate bled through, a vulnerability the assembled healers had never before witnessed from their king. "Do what you need to do. I will stay out of your way, but I am not leaving her." The senior healer, a woman named Bridget who had trained Elena personally throughout her apprenticeship, studied him for a long moment, before nodding once, understanding perhaps better than anyone else present exactly what this moment represented for a man who had spent 8 years carefully avoiding precisely this kind of vulnerability. "Then stay," Bridget said simply, turning her attention back to Elena, her hands moving with practiced urgency as she began the delicate work of drawing the wolfsbane poison from Elena's wound, before it could spread further through her already weakened system. "But you must remain calm. She needs stillness around her right now, not chaos." Damien nodded, forcing himself to remain silent despite the storm of fear and fury churning within him, watching helplessly as Bridget and 2 other senior healers worked with focused intensity, applying poultices and administering careful doses of counteracting herbs, their expressions growing increasingly grave as the minutes stretched into hours without significant improvement in Elena's condition. Night fell fully outside the healing quarters, and still Elena remained unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin cold despite the layers of blankets the healers had wrapped carefully around her. Damien remained at her side throughout, refusing food, refusing rest, refusing every gentle suggestion from concerned members of his own family who arrived throughout the evening to offer support. Aunt Lorna arrived sometime past midnight, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with a sorrow that softened her usual stern demeanor considerably. She did not attempt to convince Damien to leave, understanding perhaps better than most exactly what this moment cost him, watching the woman he loved teeter on the edge of the same fate that had already claimed one mate before her. Instead, she simply settled into a chair near the entrance of the healing quarters, a quiet, steady presence, offering silent support, without demanding anything from him in return. As the night stretched on, Elena's condition seemed to worsen rather than improve, her fever spiking dangerously despite the healer's best efforts, her breathing growing increasingly labored. Bridget's expression, usually carefully composed regardless of the severity of any situation, began carrying visible worry that she could not quite fully hide from Damien's watchful attention. "The poison has spread further than we initially hoped," Bridget admitted quietly, drawing Damien aside briefly, while another healer monitored Elena's vital signs. "We are doing everything possible, but wolfsbane of this concentration, combined with the delay before treatment began, has created significant complications." "Tell me plainly," Damien said, his voice barely steady, though he forced himself to maintain composure despite the terror clawing at his chest. "What are her chances?" Bridget hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver news she knew would devastate him further. "The next several hours will determine the outcome," she said finally. "If her fever breaks and her body begins clearing the remaining poison naturally, she has an excellent chance of full recovery. If it does not. She did not finish the sentence, though the implication hung heavy and unmistakable in the space between them. Damien returned to Elena's side, taking her cold hand carefully in his own, his thumb tracing familiar gentle circles across her knuckles, exactly as he had done so many times before during their quiet conversations in the palace gardens. Her fingers remained limp and unresponsive within his grip, offering none of the warmth he had come to treasure so deeply over the past months. "You cannot leave me," he whispered, his composure finally beginning to crack entirely now that only Elena remained close enough to witness it, the healers having stepped back to allow him a private moment. "Elena, please. I have only just found my way back to feeling something again, after years of believing myself incapable of it. I cannot lose you the way I lost her. I cannot survive that loss a second time." Her breathing remained shallow, unchanged by his desperate plea, and Damien felt something within his chest crack open entirely. 8 years of carefully maintained composure, finally shattering beneath the weight of watching the woman he loved slip further away with every passing hour. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched into what felt like an eternity for everyone gathered in the healing quarters that night. Word of the attack had spread throughout the palace, and by the deepest hours of night, a quiet crowd had gathered outside the healing quarters, warriors and healers and ordinary pack members alike, all drawn by concern for the woman who had, over the past several months, earned genuine affection from nearly everyone she had encountered throughout Blackthorn territory. Callum arrived sometime after Lorna, his own expression carrying the same grave concern that had settled over everyone present. He found Damien still seated beside Elena's bed, refusing to release her hand, even as the hours dragged on without meaningful improvement in her condition. "She saved my life in this very room," Callum said quietly, settling into a chair near his cousin, offering silent solidarity rather than empty words of comfort that would do little to ease the terror gripping Damien's chest. "She will fight through this as fiercely as she fought for me." Damien did not respond, his eyes fixed entirely on Elena's pale face, watching for any sign of improvement, any flicker of movement that might suggest her condition had begun to stabilize. Bridget and the other healers continued their careful work throughout the night, adjusting treatments, monitoring her fever, doing everything within their considerable skill to help her body fight off the lingering effects of the wolfsbane poison. It was nearing the darkest hour before dawn when Elena's condition took a sudden, alarming turn. Her breathing, already shallow and labored, suddenly grew more erratic, her body beginning to shake with violent tremors that immediately sent the healers rushing back to her bedside with urgent focus. "Her fever has spiked dangerously," Bridget said, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm, as she pressed a hand against Elena's burning forehead. "We need to cool her immediately, or the fever itself may cause damage beyond what the poison has already done." The healing quarters erupted into controlled chaos as healers moved swiftly to bring cool water and fresh cloths, working urgently to bring Elena's dangerously elevated temperature down before it could cause further harm. Damien remained frozen at her side throughout, his hand still clutched around hers, watching helplessly as her body continued to shake, her breathing growing increasingly ragged with each passing moment. "Elena," he said, his voice breaking entirely now, all pretense of royal composure abandoned completely as tears began spilling freely down his face, for the first time in 8 long years. "Please, please, do not leave me. I cannot do this again. I cannot lose you the way I lost her." The assembled crowd, both within the healing quarters and gathered outside its entrance, fell into stunned, reverent silence as they witnessed something none of them had ever thought possible. Their king, the man everyone had believed incapable of true feeling for nearly a decade, weeping openly and without restraint over the woman fighting for her life before him. "I love you," Damien continued, the words tumbling out now with a desperate urgency, as though speaking them aloud might somehow anchor her more firmly to the world of the living. "I should have told you weeks ago, should have said it the very moment I first felt it, rather than allowing fear to keep me silent for even a single additional day. Elena, please, you have to fight. You have to come back to me. I cannot lose the person who taught me how to feel again, how to hope again, after so many years believing that part of myself had died alongside Rosalind." Bridget and the other healers continued their urgent work around him, cooling Elena's fevered body, monitoring her labored breathing, but even they paused briefly at the raw, unguarded emotion pouring from their king, tears of their own gathering in more than one set of eyes, as they witnessed the depth of feeling he had kept so carefully hidden for so many years. The tremors gripping Elena's body seemed to worsen for several agonizing minutes, her breathing growing so shallow that Damien felt his own heart nearly stop in terrified response. He pressed her hand against his chest, as though the contact alone might somehow transfer his own strength into her failing body, his tears falling freely onto their joined hands as he continued whispering desperate, broken pleas for her to stay, to fight, to come back to him. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. Bridget, monitoring Elena's fever with careful, practiced attention, noticed the change first, her expression shifting from grave concern toward something approaching cautious hope. "Her temperature is beginning to drop," Bridget said, her voice carrying a note of relief that immediately drew every eye in the room. "Slowly, but it is dropping. The fever appears to be breaking." Damien's breath caught, afraid to allow himself hope too quickly given how many hours had already passed without meaningful improvement. But as several more minutes passed, Elena's violent tremors gradually began to still, her breathing slowly deepening, growing steadier and more regular with each passing moment. "Her breathing is improving," another healer confirmed, checking Elena's pulse carefully, her expression brightening with genuine relief. "Whatever the poison was doing, her body appears to finally be clearing it successfully." Damien remained frozen at her bedside, afraid to allow himself full relief until he witnessed further confirmation, watching with desperate hope as Elena's color slowly began returning, the alarming pallor that had gripped her skin throughout the night, finally giving way to something closer to her natural coloring. It was nearly dawn, the first gentle light of morning beginning to filter through the windows of the healing quarters, when Elena's eyes finally began to flutter, slowly opening for the first time since the attack along the forest path the previous afternoon. "Elena," Damien breathed, leaning forward immediately, his hand tightening around hers as her unfocused eyes gradually began to clear, finding his face hovering anxiously above her. "Damien," she murmured, her voice weak and rough, though the simple act of speaking his name sent overwhelming relief flooding through him so intensely that fresh tears immediately gathered in his eyes once more. "I am here," he said, his voice breaking despite his best efforts to remain steady for her sake. "I am here, and you are safe now. The healers have taken excellent care of you. You are going to be fine." Elena's eyes, still hazy with exhaustion and the lingering effects of her ordeal, studied his tear-streaked face with obvious confusion. "You are crying," she observed softly, her voice carrying genuine surprise despite her weakened state. "I nearly lost you," Damien said simply, no longer attempting to hide the depth of emotion he felt, the careful composure he had maintained for 8 long years, finally, permanently shattered by the terror of this night. "I have never been more afraid of anything in my entire life, Elena. Watching you fight for your breath, watching your fever rise despite everything the healers attempted, I felt certain I was going to lose you exactly as I lost Rosalind, and I do not believe I would have survived that loss a second time." Elena's expression softened despite her exhaustion, her free hand rising weakly to gently brush at the remaining tears, still tracking down his face. "I am still here," she said softly, her voice growing slightly stronger with each word. "I fought to stay. Partly because I was not ready to leave this life yet, and partly because some part of me could hear you calling me back, even through the darkness." Damien pressed a gentle kiss to her palm, overwhelmed by relief and love so profound it left him nearly speechless. Around them, the healing quarters had fallen into a hushed, emotional silence, everyone present, understanding they had just witnessed something profoundly significant, the final crumbling of walls their king had maintained for nearly a decade, replaced finally by an openness and vulnerability that suggested genuine, lasting transformation. "I love you," Damien said again, this time with steady certainty rather than desperate urgency, meeting Elena's tired but clear eyes directly. "I should have told you weeks ago. I am telling you now, and I intend to keep telling you every single day for as long as you will allow me the privilege." A weak but genuine smile spread across Elena's face, warmth returning to her eyes despite her obvious exhaustion. "I love you too," she said softly. "I believe I have, honestly, since that very first night in this exact room, though it took considerably longer for both of us to find the courage to admit it fully." Bridget, watching the exchange with visible emotion, finally stepped forward to gently interrupt, her professional instincts reasserting themselves despite the beautiful moment unfolding before her. "She needs rest now," she said gently, though her voice carried none of its usual brisk authority, softened considerably by everything she had just witnessed. Genuine rest, to allow her body to continue healing properly. Damien nodded, though he made no move to release Elena's hand, settling instead into a more comfortable position beside her bed, clearly intending to remain exactly where he was for as long as necessary. "I am not leaving her side," he said simply, and Bridget, wisely, did not attempt to argue the point. As dawn fully broke over Blackthorn territory, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, Elena drifted into peaceful, healing sleep, her hand still held securely within Damien's own. He remained beside her throughout the following hours, watching over her with a tenderness and devotion that would soon become common knowledge throughout every corner of the territory he ruled. The story of that long, terrifying night spreading quickly among the pack members who had witnessed their king's transformation firsthand. The Heartless king of Blackthorn, the man everyone had once believed incapable of feeling anything at all, had finally, completely, allowed himself to love again, and in doing so, had shown his entire pack exactly what true strength actually looked like, not the careful maintenance of walls and distance, but the courage to remain vulnerable, despite every fear that vulnerability might once again lead to devastating loss. Elena's recovery progressed steadily over the following 2 weeks, her strength gradually returning under the careful attention of Bridget and the other healers, though Damien remained a constant presence throughout, rarely leaving her side except when absolute necessity demanded his attention elsewhere for pack business. He handled his royal duties with the same steady competence he always had, but now conducted them with visible eagerness to return quickly to Elena's bedside, a transformation that continued to astonish nearly everyone throughout Blackthorn territory. News of the attack, and of Damien's raw, public display of emotion throughout that terrifying night, spread quickly through every corner of the pack, carried by the healers and warriors who had witnessed it firsthand, and shared among family members and friends, until nearly everyone within Blackthorn's borders had heard some version of the story. Rather than diminishing respect for their king, as Damien himself had quietly worried it might, the story only deepened the pack's affection and loyalty toward him, revealing a depth of feeling and humanity that made him more relatable rather than less commanding. "They speak of you differently now," Elena observed one afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the attack, as she sat comfortably in the palace gardens, for the first time since her recovery had progressed enough to allow such outings. Not with the same distant fear as before, but with genuine warmth. "I have you to thank for that," Damien said, settling beside her on their familiar stone bench, his arm wrapping naturally around her shoulders as she leaned into his warmth. "You reminded me, and apparently reminded them as well, that strength and vulnerability are not opposing forces, but rather two aspects of the same courage." Elena smiled, tilting her head to rest against his shoulder, treasuring the simple comfort of the moment after weeks of uncertainty and fear. The wound along her side had healed cleanly, leaving only a thin scar as evidence of how close she had come to losing her life entirely, a physical reminder she suspected would fade with time, even as the memory of that terrifying night remained vivid within both their minds. "What happened with Thornwood?" Elena asked, curious about the political ramifications of the attack, a subject she had deliberately avoided discussing during the earliest, most fragile days of her recovery. Damien's expression grew more serious at the question, though the underlying anger she had glimpsed occasionally over the past weeks remained carefully controlled rather than consuming him entirely. "Their Alpha has been formally confronted regarding the attack," he said, "along with clear consequences for any further aggression against Blackthorn or its people. The warriors responsible for your injury have been identified and dealt with appropriately." Elena did not press for further details, understanding that some aspects of territorial justice fell beyond her role as a healer, and trusting that Damien had handled the situation with the same measured wisdom he brought to every other aspect of his leadership. "And the broader tension between our territories? Ongoing negotiations suggest a resolution may finally be possible," Damien said. "Word of what nearly happened to you seems to have shocked even Thornwood's more moderate leadership into recognizing how close we came to open war. Sometimes tragedy, or near tragedy in this case, forces clarity that years of careful diplomacy alone cannot achieve." Elena absorbed this information quietly, grateful that some positive outcome might emerge from the terror of that night, even as she remained deeply aware of how fortunate she had been to survive an attack intended, quite deliberately, to wound Damien through her. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching early spring flowers bloom throughout the garden, the same garden where their relationship had first begun deepening months earlier through Damien's difficult confession about Rosalind. Elena found herself thinking about how far they had both traveled since that quiet evening. The walls that had seemed so permanent, finally dismantled entirely, by the fear of losing each other completely. "I have been thinking," Damien said eventually, a slight nervousness entering his voice that immediately captured Elena's full attention, given how rarely he displayed such uncertainty about anything. "About what?" Elena asked, straightening slightly to study his expression more carefully. "About the upcoming gathering ceremony," Damien said, referring to a smaller seasonal celebration scheduled for the following week, marking the official arrival of spring throughout the territory. "I would like to make a formal announcement, if you are willing." Elena felt her heart begin racing, understanding immediately the significance of what he was suggesting. "What kind of announcement?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Damien shifted to face her more directly, taking both her hands carefully within his own, his storm-gray eyes holding hers with the same intensity she had first noticed all those months ago in the healing tent, though now that intensity carried none of the guarded coldness that had once defined it. "I would like to claim you formally as my mate, before the entire pack," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. "I understand this is significant, and I would never wish to rush you towards something you do not feel ready for. But Elena, these past weeks, facing the very real possibility of losing you entirely, have shown me with absolute clarity exactly what I want for the remainder of my life. I want you beside me, openly, permanently, not simply as someone I care for privately, but as my mate before our entire territory." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes at his words, overwhelming happiness flooding through her chest as she processed the significance of what he was offering. "Damien, are you certain?" she asked softly, wanting to ensure this decision came from genuine readiness, rather than lingering fear from nearly losing her. "I have never been more certain of anything," Damien said firmly. "I spent 8 years believing myself incapable of feeling this deeply for anyone again, convinced that protecting myself required maintaining permanent distance from genuine connection. You dismantled that belief entirely, slowly and patiently, without ever demanding I move faster than I was ready for. I am ready now, Elena. More than ready. I want the entire pack to know exactly what you mean to me." "Then yes," Elena said, laughter and tears mixing together as overwhelming joy swept through her. "Yes, I would be honored to be claimed as your mate before our pack." Damien's answering smile could have illuminated the entire garden, his relief and happiness evident in every line of his expression as he pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her still healing side, holding her close with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the transformation he had undergone since her arrival in Blackthorn, nearly a year earlier. The gathering ceremony arrived the following week, the same clearing that had witnessed their initial bond recognition, now transformed, with careful decoration, befitting the significance of the occasion. Word had spread quickly throughout the territory regarding the anticipated announcement, and the clearing filled with considerably more pack members than usual, everyone eager to witness the formal culmination of a story that had captivated the entire territory over the past several months. Elena stood beside Damien as the ceremony began, dressed in flowing fabric the color of morning sunlight, the silver pendant he had given her months earlier, resting against her chest, exactly as it had every day since he first placed it there. She felt nervousness fluttering within her chest, though it remained entirely overshadowed by genuine excitement and happiness as she watched Damien step forward to address the assembled crowd. "Nearly a year ago," Damien began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing, "a healer's apprentice arrived in Blackthorn territory, entirely unaware of the transformation she would soon bring to my life, and to this entire pack." He continued, sharing with remarkable openness the journey they had traveled together, from his initial fear and rejection of their bond, through the slow, patient rebuilding of trust, to the terrifying night he nearly lost her entirely, and the clarity that terror had ultimately brought him, regarding exactly what he wanted for his future. I spent 8 years believing myself incapable of loving again, Damien said, his voice carrying raw honesty that held the entire clearing captivated. I built walls I believed were unbreakable, convinced that protecting myself from further loss required denying myself any possibility of genuine happiness. Elena Whitmore proved me wrong, patiently, persistently, refusing to give up on me even when I gave her every reason to walk away entirely. He turned to face her directly then, taking her hands within his own before the entire assembled pack, his storm-gray eyes holding hers with unwavering devotion. Elena, before our entire pack, before everyone who has witnessed both my failures and my growth throughout this past year, I claim you as my mate, not simply because fate chose this bond between us beneath the full moon those many months ago, but because every day since has shown me exactly why my wolf recognized you as precisely the partner I need to become the king, and the man I am meant to be. Elena felt tears spilling freely down her cheeks as he spoke, overwhelming joy and love swelling within her chest as she looked out at the assembled pack, seeing genuine happiness reflected on nearly every face gathered within the clearing. Mara and Colin stood near the front, both grinning with obvious delight. Aunt Lorna watched with an expression of fierce pride, while Callum and the rest of Damien's family beamed with genuine warmth at the formal recognition of what had already become evident to everyone throughout the palace months earlier. I claim you as well, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly despite her emotional state. Not simply as my mate, but as my partner, in every sense that matters. You have shown me, throughout this past year, exactly what true strength looks like, not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to embrace it fully, despite every fear that vulnerability might bring pain. I am honored to walk beside you, Damien Ashford, for as long as we both shall live. The clearing erupted into joyful celebration as Damien pulled her into his arms, sealing their formal claiming with a kiss that left no doubt throughout the entire territory regarding the depth of devotion now permanently bound between them. Cheers and applause rang throughout the clearing, the pack celebrating not simply the union of their king with his chosen mate, but the remarkable transformation they had all witnessed unfold throughout the past year, watching their once heartless king rediscover his capacity for genuine, unguarded love. In the months that followed, Blackthorn territory flourished under Damien and Elena's combined leadership, the healer's steady compassion, perfectly complementing the king's renewed strength and openness. The tension with Thornwood gradually resolved into lasting peace, negotiated with the same patient wisdom that had characterized Damien's slow journey toward accepting love again, after so many years of carefully guarded grief. Elena continued her healing work throughout the territory, now respected not simply as a skilled healer, but as the beloved partner of their king, her influence extending Blackthorn's reputation for compassionate, thoughtful leadership throughout the surrounding territories. Damien, for his part, remained forever transformed by the journey they had traveled together. No longer the distant, guarded figure everyone had once whispered about with cautious fear, but a king whose genuine warmth and devotion to his mate became legendary throughout the region. Everyone had once warned Elena that the Alpha King of Blackthorn was heartless, incapable of feeling anything beyond cold duty and careful control. She had learned, through months of patient devotion, and one terrifying night that nearly cost her everything, exactly how wrong that reputation had been. Beneath the careful walls Damien had built to protect himself from further loss, beat a heart capable of profound, unwavering love, one that had simply needed someone patient enough, and brave enough, to help him remember how to let it beat freely once again. And as the seasons continued turning throughout Blackthorn territory, their story became something the pack told with genuine pride, not a tale of a heartless king finally softened by fate, but a testament to the truth that even the deepest grief need not permanently close a heart against the possibility of love, so long as courage remained enough to try again, one patient, vulnerable step at a time.